Open your Bibles, the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17. There's a battle on, and the men of Israel and Judah had gathered over against the valley of Elah, and the battle was in array against the Philistines. In verse 3 of the 17th chapter, the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. Now we're introduced to one of the men of the Philistines by the name of Goliath of Gath, a man of tremendous stature, a man of powerful strength and stamina, a man that was called a giant even in those days. And so he defied the armies of Israel and cursed the God of Israel. And we find that in the course of time, Jesse said to his youngest son David, said, you go see how the battle goes and take some refreshments to your two brothers, or your brothers that had joined the army, the three eldest sons, it is, of Jesse. So, that's in verse 13. David, he took his chariot and he proceeded to do what his father Jesse had told him to do. Now, as this lesson unfolds, in verse 26, David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, what shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Well, they tell him who he is, and he, of course, was very upset at this situation that had developed there. And he couldn't do anything with the people. And finally, in verse 29, David said, when the people had given him a negative answer, he said, what have I done? Is there not a cause? And he turned from him toward another and spake after the same manner. And the people answered him again after the former manner. After the former manner. Now get that. Here's a people that's supposed to be the army, and they answer David in a negative way. Now David is a young fellow. He's just a youngster, in fact, according to the context of Scripture. But he didn't like what was going on. So he called attention to it. And his three eldest brothers criticized him and brought a charge against him and really criticized him, and the other people joined in. You can always find, ladies and gentlemen, somewhere along the line, a cause to be negative if you wish to have one. You can always see some giants in your life. You can always find some reasons for not doing things for God. If you really want to. It's entirely up to you. It all depends on the way you look at it. This is an age-old illustration, but it's still true. One man, speaking about a glass with water in it, he says the glass is half empty. Another man will say the glass is half full. There is a difference in the way you express it. And life is made up of people, I'm talking about the community of people just like that. One crowd is saying the glass is half empty. Another crowd is saying the glass is half full. One crowd talks about the darkness. Another crowd talks about the beautiful moonlight, starlight night. It all depends on the feelings that's within your heart. A man expresses himself with his words, his actions and his words. By thy words thou shalt be justified, Luke said, and by thy words thou shalt be condemned. Now, it's true that a careless life can be a part of what I'm talking about, but still, on the other hand, it's what's within a man. He expresses it either by attitude or by words or by both. Now, I realize that in the course of life there's going to be tears and a lot of disappointments. And things may not go exactly. I talked to two of our young men that have started a business in these volatile times and these times when financing is not easy, and when, according to the papers, thousands of businesses go bankrupt a year and so on. But these young men said, we put our faith and trust in God, and we're going to depend upon Him to help us. Well, now, that you've got to give them A for trying. They mean business. And remember that when any man starts out for God, as a preacher, as a missionary, or a preacher's wife, and I certainly could dwell at length on that, when a young girl marries a man that says that he's going to be a preacher, she's asking for some things, because that is not the most normal life that a lady could choose. It's a abnormal life. It's not anything like that. The wife of a businessman or some other professional man. It's altogether different, because you're dealing with people generally of a negative approach. Now, I have a little granddaughter, and she said to me some time ago, she said, "Granddaddy, I want to marry a preacher." Well, I told her, I said, well, that's entirely up to you. And you and the Lord, and what the Lord works out for you. And if that's the way you want life, I'm sure God can work those things out. Now, she not only has a granddaddy that's a preacher, but a daddy that's a preacher. And her oldest brother is a preacher. You say, well, it runs in the family. Well, I don't know about that. It may run in the fact that some people are willing for God to use them and some people are not. That could have something to do with it. Now, I want you to see about 5 things here concerning David in this text. I have a great admiration for him. First place, he's a young chap, but he's not too young to be used. He's a bold and courageous young chap. Now, the armies, according to verses 10 and 26, the armies of Israel had been defied. He had defied those armies, old Goliath had. Now, the problem that the armies of Israel had is not going to go away. They were arrayed across that valley of Elah. On one side of the valley was the armies of the Philistines, and on the other mountain on the other side were the armies of Israel. But the problem wouldn't go away. Have you found that to be true in your life? As a soldier of the cross, let's be practical. Let's just look at life realistically. You may not want to face it, but brother, the armies of the enemy are going to be arrayed on the other side all the time. And you're going to have to decide sooner or later in your life whether or not the course in life you're taking and the philosophy in life that you have and the rock-ribbed determinations in life that you have, that they are right and you're not going to change. You have to come to grips with that. You know, Joshua said, as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. That's a mighty hard decision to make. You know, generally we turn to God when everything else has failed. But he said, as for me and my house, he answered for the whole house. When the Philippian jailer got said, the book said his house did too, his whole house, that is his family. I believe it's right for a man to claim his family for God. I see no reason why he shouldn't. Why shouldn't a man want his sons and daughters to be saved? Why shouldn't a man want his grandchildren to be saved? What's wrong with that? Why shouldn't a man want his children to honor God? All right, now you notice this problem wouldn't go away. Saul and the 3 eldest sons of Jesse and the other men of Israel, they couldn't do anything about it. It's still a problem. Now, what's the answer to it? How are they going to resolve that? Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's true with each and every one of us. There are some things in your life you're going to either have to get it right or the aliens will take you. Let me be very personal about this. I find as a senior pastor, as a veteran preacher, that a lot of people have been destroyed by illness. And yet they live to be, at a reasonable age. But all through their illness, they were plagued with that thing, and it dominated and intimidated and controlled their life. It sounds a little facetious and humorous. I had an aunt in my family, and from the time I could remember, all she ever did was complain. But the old soul lived up to about 90. But all I ever heard, isn't that strange that I remember my aunt, and all that I remember about her was complaining. She was sick. She'd read all of the doctor's books. Back in those days, it was hard to get a doctor, It was over 100 miles to the first hospital from where we lived. And she just complained. That's what I remember about her. Now, wasn't that some kind of big deal, that influence she left on my life? Now, in that same family, she had a brother that was a noble Christian. His influence on my life as an uncle lives on. And when he's dead and gone, if I outlive him, he's still living, he's aged. But oh, what an influence he had on my life. A tremendous singer, a man of great ability and great compassion. He had a little girl that had the measles when she was a few months old, and she became deaf and mute, and she couldn't ever talk, and they didn't have schools for the deaf or hard of hearing in those days, and so it was a cause of real grief to him. And he wanted a son. He loved boys. Never did have a son. But what an influence that man had on my life. All right, now look, here are two people. One is an uncle, the other an aunt. All I remember about my aunt, she was a good woman. I don't reckon she was good for anything much, but just good. But all that she ever influenced me with was her constant, continuous complaining about being sick. Have you ever thought about how devastating that could be? I was just a kid. But all I could remember of her being, she's just complaining. Felt bad all the time, lived to be 90. Couldn't have had much wrong with her to live that long. She should have felt good at least a day or two out of 90 years. I never remember hearing my uncle complain. He was all the time thinking about somebody else. He was all the time giving of himself. He has sung for hundreds of funerals, scores of revival meetings, hundreds of revivals, lead the singing, hook his team to a buggy and travel 6-8 miles every night after working in the fields to direct music in open air meetings under a brush arbor or in a hot little old church building. Never one time did I hear him complain. Singing praises for God. Wait a minute. He was a David. I'm talking about a man with a cause. Is your cause just grumbling and complaining about you don't feel good? You're afraid that where you work are going out of business and this and that, just all the time living on the very brink of total disaster. David is not that kind of a man. The problem will really not go away. How are you going to resolve it? I want you to notice another thing about God's armies. In verse 11, they got terribly discouraged. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistines, they were dismayed. I mean, they were dismayed. It had a great effect upon them. You notice that? They were discouraged. That's one of the devil's chiefest weapons against a Christian or against a human being, is to discourage him with life. The devil will weave webs around you and he'll work things out and get you discouraged. And brother, let me tell you something. Discouragement is sin. All of us have to fight it all the time. And the longer you stay in the Lord's work, perhaps the most difficult it is. I'll tell you one thing. We could take a survey, line up all these bus drivers right here before us this evening. And my wife and I were talking today at the lunch table about her bus route. And the people that work on that bus route, they all work together as a team. And I said, how many did you have today? And she told me how many they had. I said, all right, now, if we have put on 60 routes lately, I said, you can multiply the number you had today, the net number of kids and teenagers, by 60, and see how many we would have had. Several hundred people over our attendance last year. And she suddenly realized, well, you don't have to reach everybody, but if you're reaching some, then you see it's encouraging. That's how the devil defeats people. He gets us discouraged, and we think, well, she told about a grandmother telling Billy over here, she could hear the grandmother in the background, said, I thought I told you to tell them that you were going to another church. And can you imagine a grandmother, I think it was, in the background telling that little granddaughter, and the little granddaughter wants to come to Landmark, and they don't like the other place, and they weren't going to the other place until we got them started, I believe. And now the grandmother, and no doubt unsaved, trying to keep them away. Now here it is, some ladies and Big Tom Smith, a big old fullback football player that used to play here at the university, driving that bus and giving of themselves. And would you believe it? Loving the kids more than the grandmother. That is what I'm talking about. Brother David saw the circumstances. He assumed some responsibility, and he cried out to the men of Israel, is there not a cause? And that's the kind of people you have to have in your church if you're going to do anything for God. You can't have an army like Israel had, and they are discouraged. If you will notice in the latter part of that 11th verse, they were not even trying to find a way out. They were just looking across the valley. And you know what the last part of that verse said? They were greatly afraid. You know what? Fear had conquered them then. They were demoralized. Notice that. They were greatly afraid. That's what verse 11 said of that 17th chapter. How in the name of high heaven are you going to win anything for God when you have people who let the enemy get away by defying the work of God? Some of you people misunderstand me when and maybe you don't even appreciate it, but when I tell you, when a banker, head of a loan department, like one did years ago, that I told you about this morning, he deliberately said he'd see that reverend in hell with that church before he'd make a loan to him. Well, that's his right. Now, why would he say that when we had never hurt him? When we had never harmed him in any way? And when we had collateral? You want me to tell you? Like the armies of the Philistines. They hated the God of Israel. And so they were defying. Old Goliath was cursing Israel and their God. Don't you understand that? All right, this is a pattern of life. And if you haven't found this out, you haven't yet begun to live. You have to understand that you've got some very real enemies. And they'll set themselves in array against you. Now, it could be fear. And it could be discouragement. And you'll be completely demoralized. There are people listening to me at this very moment in this auditorium. And the devil has used and schemed and got you demoralized, and you don't have any victory. You know why? You know the only way you can get back is to get on your knees and confess to God. I said the other day, somebody, we were talking, and I had mentioned the fact that Brother Pat Schreiber was going to help us out a while over at Newport. He has a job, and he's preaching over there for the time being. And this person said something to me about Pat, and I said, yes, I want to tell you something. I said, he's one of the few young men that I've had anything to do with when he really messed up that was big enough to search me out and ask for an appointment and to sit down in my office and to break down and weep his soul out and say, preacher, I just messed up my ministry. I really did. And I want you to forgive me, and I've asked God to forgive me. Did you know that you find very few people that have the grace and the gumption to do something like that? Well, some of you people sitting here this evening in this auditorium looking at me, and you bark and snap at each other, and you never have said to your companion, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I hurt you. I'm so sorry that I've hurt you. Would you forgive me? You have to appreciate people for what they are. I see one of our men, he's been a deacon in this church, Brother Lano Bell, and I referred to him this morning. I think I have it correct that a few months after I came here, we had 2 buses we owned besides those we were chartering from the Cincinnati Transit. And I started Brother Lano Bell and another young man driving those 2 church-owned buses. And you know, he would go on vacation and get back to drive his bus on Sunday. Seldom ever did he miss a Sunday. And for years, he drove on Sunday night. Now, in recent years, he has changed jobs, and there's been occasions when he had to work Sundays. And he didn't have any control over that, and somebody'd have to get a driver for him. Can you imagine a man driving for 30 years and missing very few Sundays? Brother Bell, I really appreciate faithfulness. I think I appreciate faithfulness and dependability more than nearly anything. Somebody that just keeps on and never quitting and doing their best and never complaining and say, I'll do what I can. Look, these people, as far as victory is concerned, had quit. They were over on the hill, and Goliath had challenged them, and they were sore afraid, and they were dismayed. In other words, they were demoralized. Let me direct your attention to verse 30. Look at it. Look at it. And he turned from him toward another and spake after the same manner, and the people answered him again after the former manner. You know what had happened? These people were defeated. They said it can't be done. They said it just won't work. David tried to pull them out. He tried to get them to change their attitude. He tried to get them to talk differently. But they said, you can't do it. He's a giant. They'll destroy us. Well, what are you going to do when you're confronted with an enemy like that and you give up? It's a settled fact that you're already licked. And again, we get back to this thing. Let me take you to the very beginning in the matter of salvation. Brother, if you'll listen to me, I can help you. Why would you let the devil destroy you in a Christless eternity? Answer me that. Why would you let man's arch enemy destroy you and you'd have to burn forever and ever and ever? Why, I ask you? We find the prophet Ezekiel saying, why will you die, O house of Israel? Another prophet said, the harvest is past, the summer's ended, and you're not saved. Why will a man let that evil one destroy him? He said that the devil has the power of death. God said that. Why would you let him do you that way? And then, Christian, why would you let him have your life? Don't you understand that the Christian has within his own grasp his life? What is your life? What will you do with it? I tell you, the philosophy of this man, David, is something. My, a young lad, and here he is facing a whole army, facing King Saul. He said, is there not a cause? Why are you men of the military sitting down, shaking, fearful, afraid, listening to that cursing Philistine and not doing something about it? Did you notice what he said? What shall be done to this man that killeth this Philistine and taketh away the reproach from Israel? Israel have been reproached. For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Oh, how we need men today of courage. Men in the pulpit, men in the pew, young people in our Christian institutions that have enough backbone to stand up for righteousness' sake. When I read in the paper this past week that the dope traffic in this country was grossing more than $50 billion, I almost cried aloud. Is this my country? Is this my country? That my people of this country is absorbing, using more than $50 billion in illicit drugs, and that does not include alcoholic beverages. Folks, do you realize what's wrong with this nation? Our nation is on a toboggan down the broad way that leads to destruction. Surely, time is running out. In the 9th chapter of the book of Daniel prayed, we have sinned. We have sinned. Isaiah in chapter 1 cried out, my people doth not know. My people doth not consider. God said, your vain oblations are an abomination unto me. Turn ye. For why will you die, O house of Israel? America, I think, is on trial, brother. I believe last fall there was a glimmer of hope. There seemed to be a little bit of light that seemed to break through the clouds. Some American people trying to reach out to a stable form of government, to a stable society, but really a lot of them didn't know what they were reaching for. You know how I know? Simply because most of the churches of America are being emptied on Sunday night. Most of them don't even have services. Don't you understand that we're in a vacuum? There's a famine in the land, brother. Not of bread, not of things to eat, but of hearing the Word of God. And there's a cause. Oh, God help us. God help us to realize in this nation of ours the need is great and time's running out. We need Christian educational institutions to try to train our young people in a day of apostasy. We need young men that'll go out to preach the unsearchable riches of Jesus Christ. We need church people in the pew that'll volunteer to do things for God. That'll find it necessary to be out when the doors of the church are open and not just visit and be onlookers and be observers. God have mercy on us, just being observers. I'm so sick and tired of it. People that have no commitment and no burden and no concern about the souls of men. We come to observe, to criticize, to find fault, to pick out things that we don't like. Like a man said to me the other day, he said, well, I agree with you about 90% of the time. Suppose you sit down with your wife and you tell her, I agree with you part of the time. You don't mold a home together like that. Or the children telling the parents, we agree with you about 90% of the time. You need to talk about those things you have in common interest, offering thanks at the table, reading the Word of God, talking about Jesus, talking about people that you're interested in, you pray for, talking about the growth of the church, talking about the number of people baptized, talking about the fine young people that are in youth camp, talking about the wonderful young people that's in Christian training, talking about those things when you see growth and development. Young men that's growing for God and going for God. That, my friend, are the things that ought to occupy our conversation. And it ought to dominate our lives. There is a cause, I tell you. And here's one lone man, just a youngster, probably in his teens. And you know what? Even his own family criticized him. And King Saul, he was a vacillating type of individual. head and shoulders above his fellows, but he'd let this one little boy go down into the valley of Elah to face old Goliath. I've been to that valley and seen the mountains on either side. I thought about it as I stood there and looked at that young chap as he worked his way down the hillside into the valley, and there at the brook pick up those 5 smooth stones and face that cursing giant, probably 10 feet tall or more. You talk about courage. You talk about conviction, brother. This generation, we don't have any conviction anymore. We don't have any standards much anymore. We don't have any commitment to God anymore. Men and women, listen, God looks upon us when the bedroom door is closed and we have to face self. He knows what's within our hearts. Yes, He does. The hypocrisy, the indifference, the carelessness. Yes, God's army, it needed a man that had his dependence in God. And thank God David had that. He said to old Goliath, he took his staff in his hand. He chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, put them in the shepherd's bag, and he had his scrip in there, and his sling was in his hand. And when he drew near to that Philistine came on and drew near unto David. And the man that bare the shield went before him, had a big shield out before him. And you know what? When the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. I would assume he wasn't even old enough to start shaving. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Think of that. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the fields. Then David said to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into my hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee, and will give thy carcass of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and the wild beasts, that all the earth may know that there's a God in Israel. And I tell you, beloved, tonight the need is that the men of America will know there's a God in America. Oh, how we need this today. With the rivers of intoxicating alcoholic beverages advertised on radio and television, I get so sick and tired of light beer. I don't think they know what they mean by light. The damnable stuff that'll send a man home drunk to beat his family, like you read in the paper the other day. Listen, and the wave of lawlessness and what's going on across this nation. President being shot and little boys killed down in Atlanta and little babies killed by dope heads. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time for America to wake up. And for the people of America to have a spiritual backbone like David had, that you'll do something to right the wrongs that's in this country. Oh, God, help us. There is a cause. And we need to come to this generation in the name of the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, the Christ of the cross, who is able to change wicked, vile men and make them sober and make them clean and make them whole. Let's stand for prayer, shall we? May God bless this message to the hearts of both this audience and that of our radio family. Bow your heads with me for a moment. There is a cause. Do you have a cause tonight? Mister, do you have a cause? What is your cause? To hinder or to help? To bless or to curse? To weaken or to strengthen? What is your cause? If you're a bus driver, you have a cause tonight. If you're a superintendent, member of the working staff, you have a cause. What is your cause tonight? To help men, to help people. How many of you tonight could honestly say, Brother Rawlings, really I have a cause. My heart's burdened. There's some things God has been dealing with me about, and it's heavy upon my soul. I want you to pray for me. Would you lift your hand? God bless you. God bless you. God bless you. God bless you, dear people. It's personal, isn't it? There's a cause. Some of you fooling around, fiddling around. Some of you young people, you're treating God with disdain. God doesn't like that. God wants us to heed His voice. Wants us to be real. There is a cause tonight. My country is worth saving. My country is worth keeping it free. It's worth any price that we have to pay to keep it free. I would remind you that the freedom we enjoy tonight, ladies and gentlemen, has been bought with the price of blood. You go back yonder several hundred years ago, and when the founding fathers came across the ocean in their little boats, many of them died in the way. Many of them went through great privations and hardships. I think of those noble frontier women